Hello! In this video, we're going to learn about the basics of small ternary form. Small ternary form is also called rounded binary form. Which term is used just depends on which book you're reading. I'm going to use the term small ternary because that's what William Kaplan calls it, and he explains this form quite well. You can find an outline of this form as well as some musical examples on the PDF called Week 11 Small Ternary Examples handout. You can find this handout on the Week 11 module of Canvas. So where do we hear small ternary forms? Well, they appear in minuets in, say, a minuet by Haydn. Sometimes the main theme from a sonata movement, say a movement by Beethoven, is a small ternary, such as the opening theme of a first movement or the main theme of a slow movement. You hear small ternary forms in dance movements, such as mazurkas by Chopin or waltzes by Tchaikovsky. And small ternary forms even appear in slightly modified fashion in the 20th century, such as in big band tunes by Duke Ellington, or blues, rock, and pop songs, such as songs by Carole King, or many others. So, what are the ingredients of this form, which seems to crop up everywhere and which has a long and distinguished history? The small ternary form has three parts: the exposition, the digression or contrasting middle, those two terms being the same thing, and the recapitulation. Before I go on, I should note that you might recognize the terms exposition and recapitulation from sonata form, but you should know that these two terms, exposition and recapitulation, mean something a little bit different when we're talking about small ternary. Later this semester, we'll talk about sonata forms, and you'll find that the exposition and recapitulation are a little more involved. For now, first, let's learn about what happens in a small ternary exposition. The main thing the exposition must do is reach an authentic cadence. That authentic cadence can be in the home key, in other words, the opening key, or it can be in a new key. In other words, this section can modulate. Some writers say that when the authentic cadence is in a home key, it's called a sectional form, and when it's in a new key, it's called a continuous form. The exposition is usually a standard 8 or 16 measure form, and so in other words, it's usually a sentence or a period or something that combines features of the two, and it typically falls into 2 or 4 or 8 measure phrases. Let's write an exposition of a small ternary movement. And so I'm going to make this a modulating period. And so just to remind you, a period, also called a parallel period, is when you have two phrases and they both begin with the same musical idea. I'm calling that musical idea a BI, which stands for basic idea. The first phrase is called the antecedent, and it ends with a weaker cadence, usually a half cadence, and the second phrase is called the consequent, and it ends with a stronger cadence, almost always an authentic cadence. In a modulating period, the second phrase also modulates to a new key and ends with an authentic cadence in a new key. Let's first come up with a basic idea. Here it is. It's not very interesting, but it will do. Here's my antecedent phrase. I need a half cadence here. Half cadence. Now I'm going to come up with a consequent phrase, and this one will have to modulate and then end with an authentic cadence in that new key. Opening basic idea. Now we'll modulate. There we go. I've modulated to the key of 5. Now let's add some chords. Let's try that again. Let me play that whole thing so you can hear the two phrases, one after the other. we go. That is my exposition. Next, we'll talk about the contrasting middle. So what features does a contrasting middle tend to have? The first thing to know is that the contrasting middle is characterized by instability. And in a moment, we'll talk about what that means for a passage to sound musically unstable. Second, the contrasting middle almost always ends on 5 of the home key. So let's talk about each of those features in turn. So first, the contrasting middle is characterized by instability. So what musical ideas make something unstable? First, the contrasting middle avoids beginning on the tonic. The tonic is a stable home point, so when we avoid a tonic beginning, it sounds less stable. Not only that, but very often the contrasting middle will have just less frequent tonic chords in general. Also, the contrasting middle will often have dominant pedals or longer prolongations of 5. Sometimes this prolongation of 5 or a 5 pedal can take up the entire section. The contrasting middle also has markers that are often associated with transitional sections. Those include things like shorter motives and sequences and chromaticism. So those are all markers of instability. The contrasting middle also ends on 5 of the home key. That can happen in one of 3 ways. First, the entire section could be a long 5 pedal, and if the entire section is a 5 pedal, then the ending will be 2. Second, the contrasting middle could end with a half cadence or just some arrival on 5/7 or an inverted 5. Finally, it's also possible for the contrasting middle to end with an authentic cadence in the key of 5, but because that's still 5 in relationship to the home key, that counts. Let's write a contrasting middle section. I'm going to begin first off tonic. So remember this opening movement. The opening of this small ternary was in G major. So I'll begin with 5 of G major. And I'm going to arpeggiate 5, or really 5/7, because I have a 7th there on the right hand. I'm going to arpeggiate 5 in the bass line. Now I'll go to 1, but it's not the beginning of the phrase. And then finally I'll end with a half cadence with a 5/4/3 of 5 going to 5. And then I'll throw in a little common tone, diminished 7th going to 5/7, just for fun. Here's the whole contrasting middle. And that's our contrasting middle. Finally, what happens in the recapitulation? Well, the first thing to know is that the recapitulation always begins with the same melodic idea as the exposition. Do you remember what that was in this little piece we were writing? It sounded like this. So the recapitulation will begin with that idea. Second, the recapitulation always ends with an authentic cadence in the home key. This means that if the exposition ends with an authentic cadence in a non-tonic key, in other words, in a new key, the recapitulation will somehow have to be adjusted in order to stay in the home key and end back home. Sometimes the recapitulation restates the opening material and then ends pretty quickly and shortens the original material from the exposition. Sometimes it lengthens it. It adds extra insertions or extra digressions and lengthens the form. Both are possible. I'm going to write a recapitulation now for this little small ternary piece we're writing, and I'm going to make it shorter just to keep things efficient. I'm going to start with that same basic idea, but rather than having 2 phrases, I'm just going to have a single phrase that ends with an authentic cadence in the home key. So let's try that right now. Here's our opening basic idea that we also heard at the beginning of the exposition. Let's try that again. Now I just need to reach an authentic cadence in the home key. There we go. And we're done. That's the end of our form. So here's an overview of the entire form. Let me play the whole thing just to remind you of how the different sections go. Exposition. Contrasting middle. Recapitulation. And that is the basic layout of a small ternary form. As you can imagine, this form lends itself to quite a bit of variation and quite a bit of creativity, which could be one reason why it was so popular among composers. But there's one more thing you should know about this form before we move on, and that is sometimes some of these sections are repeated. So here are some typical schemes for repetition of some of these sections. First, in many small ternary forms, the exposition is repeated, and then the contrasting middle and recapitulation together are repeated. In other words, we have exposition, exposition, contrasting middle and recapitulation, contrasting middle and recapitulation. The repetitions can be indicated with repeat signs, or they could be written out, if, for example, the composer wanted to add ornamentation or have contrast in instrumentation. Another option, sometimes just the exposition is repeated, and then the contrasting middle and recapitulation are only stated once. Or, less commonly but also possible, the exposition is just stated once, and then the contrasting middle and recapitulation are played twice. In other words, we have exposition, then contrasting middle, recapitulation, contrasting middle, recapitulation. You now know the basic outline of a small ternary form. In the next videos, we'll start listening to some pieces and see how they fulfill these requirements. Hope to join you again soon.